Bom dia. Sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos.
Olá, eu sou de...
I am Caroline. I come from the Communications Department of NIC.br. On behalf of CGI and NIC, I welcome you to the 10th Seminar of Personal Data and Privacy Protection. And we also welcome those that are online. As many of you know, initiatives such as this are possible because part of the money collected under NIC.br are allocated to those actions. We are very happy because we are celebrating 30 years of .br. And to share that with you, we have a video of Demi Getúlio telling a bit of this history.
Eu sou Demi Getúlio, do NIC.br, Núcleo de Informação do .br. O .br está comemorando 30 anos e ele foi incluído no país antes mesmo da internet existir. O .br é um domínio de topo para o código do país BR. Como todo domínio de topo, ele é usado para identificar o sobrenome dos endereços e serviços da internet. Quando a internet ainda não existia no Brasil, já tínhamos o BR registrado para identificar máquinas das redes acadêmicas que já operavam aqui, como Bitnet, Rapnet. E foi assim que tudo começou. Em 18 de abril de 89, John Postel, a IANA, delegou o domínio BR ao grupo que operava redes acadêmicas na FAPESP. Postel considerou que essa comunidade brasileira já tinha maturidade para administrar o BR diretamente. Em pouco tempo, as redes acadêmicas originais Bitnet e Rapnet foram substituídas pela internet. Em janeiro de 91 já tínhamos a primeira troca de pacotes usando o TCP/IP. Outro marco importante foi a criação da estrutura de nomes sobre o BR. À época, as universidades ficaram diretamente debaixo do domínio BR. E, em sequência, foram criadas as primeiras categorias voltadas para governo, GovBR, empresas, como BR, organizações sem fins de lucro, ORG.br, e as Forças Armadas, MIL.br. Em 1995, tanto no Brasil como em outros países, a internet comercial veio à tona. Imaginava-se inicialmente que o brasileiro teria dificuldades com a internet comercial porque o conteúdo dela tendia a ser em inglês. Isso foi logo desmentido com o surgimento de um vasto número de provedores com conteúdo em português. Em 95 foi criado o Comitê Gestor da Internet do Brasil para coordenar e integrar as iniciativas relacionadas à rede no país. A internet e o .br cresceram e o NIC.br, uma entidade sem fins de lucro, foi criado para administrar o domínio e assumir outras obrigações. Hoje temos 4 milhões de domínios registrados, uma das maiores bases do mundo. A receita arrecadada pelo registro de nomes sobre o BR, além de manter esta atividade com excelência técnica, provendo inclusive cópias de servidores em países como Alemanha, Coreia do Sul, Estados Unidos e outros, reverte a verba que recebe em ações para benefício da internet no Brasil. Por exemplo, o NIC opera pontos de troca de tráfego, promove cursos de capacitação para profissionais, dissemina IPv6, produz pesquisa sobre o uso da internet, entre outras atividades. Para você fazer parte dessa comunidade e registrar no BR, não faltam opções. São mais de 120 subdomínios disponíveis em diversas categorias. Nesses 30 anos de BR, temos muito a comemorar e muito a agradecer. O trabalho segue em expansão. O CGI.br e o NIC.br continuam em busca de uma internet cada vez melhor para o país.
Nosso muito obrigado.
We thank you all those that chose .br as their domain name on the web. Some announcements before we start. Questions to all activities in the seminar should be preferably asked on the web app at minhaagenda.nic.br. That will make it easier for us to receive the questions that are of people here and also those that are following us online. Also, those who are attending will have a QR code and link to access the system. If you have any question, the receptionists can help you. For those of you that are online, if you find any difficulty, please contact us by the chat box. And once again, questions, especially those online, are not going to be taken via chat. It has to be through the system, minhaagenda.nic.br. For those that are here, we'll also have microphone available that are going to be with the receptionists. The pictures of the event are going to be made available in the social media. The assessment forms are going to be sent to you by email. The first presentation is going to be in English, so if you need translation, outside you have receivers for translation. Tomorrow, one of you attending is going to receive, we are going to draw air tickets and participation of the Manaus Forum in October. So good luck to you all. So to start this morning's activities, we are going to ask for the opening panel, the representatives that are part of the organization of this event. And in this way, we are thanking the partnership of the Federal Prosecutor's Office, represented by Luis Costa, the Center of Research and Innovation of Getúlio Vargas Foundation, represented by Marina Pfefferbaum, ISOC Brazil, represented by Flávio Resch Wagner, and Dan Getúlio, CEO of NIC.br, and Hartmut Lazar, Executive Secretary of CGI.br, on behalf of Maxileno Martinhão, coordinator of CGI, that is going to coordinate the activities of this panel. I wish you all a very good event. Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for the Managing Committee to start today the 10th event connected to data privacy and more legal issues related to the Internet. Some people say that the Internet is something without laws. We think that's exaggeration. In fact, you need order for the Internet to work well. So having one more event, coordinating by this team with the leadership of CGI and with the details of Nick and our team is an honor and a pleasure. So I'm going to start giving the floor to Demi Getsko for his initial remarks, and little by little, each one of you will have the floor. Demi, well, good morning again. Good morning, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here in the 10th Seminar of Data Protection. And obviously, the juice of the meeting will come next. We are just making an introduction here. I think the positive points are many. First, it's important to be stubborn. I think the 10th seminar proves how of the general protection, data protection law that is going to be in effect as of next year. And I think that one of the chairs is reserved for CGI in that area. So this is very important. So here in the panel we have Luis Costa, that from the beginning was a major motivator of the meeting. He came to talk to us at NIC to talk about the importance of the Internet talking about protection, because obviously the Internet is an important player in data protection, because it does have some abuses, and we have to see to that. And Luis Costa has been with us from the beginning. And another thing that is very nice is that in 2000, for instance, we had 94 people attending, 224 enrolled. In 15, 165, 300. And this year we have 989 enrolled. We don't know how many attending, but the room is full, so it shows that we are at the peak of the seminar. And also online participation, that was 0 in 2010, was 125 last year, so it's going very well. So I think this is an extremely hot topic. I think that has to do with how tenacious we were discussing the subject. We were able to pass laws. This law is going to be in effect as of next year. We have to see how well implemented it's going to be for the benefit of our country and the internet. And once again, I thank you very much for coming. The support team, events, logistics, legal, everyone involved in the process. And I wish you all an excellent event. Thank you, Professor Demi. And now I'm going to turn to Marina Pfefferbaum from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo. Good morning, everyone. I'm always very moved, very emotional of being here in this event, especially because yesterday I was in an event that brought together educators and the whole of the committee and talked about the importance of data protection and the challenges of the internet. So I'm here representing the Research, Innovation and Study Center of Fundação Getúlio Vargas that has been joint efforts with CGI to try and bring a new culture that protects data, that takes care of the internet as society as a whole. And in this agenda, as an educator, we see that this agenda is more cross-sectional, especially in a law school, that is where I come from. All subjects are becoming more cross-sectional. Everybody's looking into data protection. We are no longer segregating information in different disciplines as we used to do in the past. And in this seminar, we see how important it is to have this number of players from different segments of society. The university, government, civil society joining each panel. So I'm very emotional about being here representing Fundação Getúlio Vargas and building together knowledge. And I wish you all an excellent seminar. Thank you, Marina. And now we are going to Professor Wagner, representing ISOC Brazil. Good morning, everyone. I thank the organizing committee for the invitation for the 10th Seminar of Data Protection. It's a pleasure to represent Internet Society in this 10th edition of the event. In this moment of evolution of technology and social economy, where we have more and more data being collected and data have more value in the community, replacing oil and gold, users and the protection of our data becomes essential for society to establish the fundamental issues for us to follow and advocate, having laws, good practices, norms, and terms of use. Internet Society was founded in 1992. Today it gathers 100 national chapters, like the Brazilian chapter, and tens of thousands of members throughout the world. It wants to defend open internet, connected, globally innovative, safe, and reliable to everyone. This trust will only come and new users and services will only be able to happen if we can implement universally accepted principles, one of them being respect to privacy and protection of personal data. Internet Society released a paper in the past saying that data protection makes data or internet services to be more trusted, but we are always under pressure. Internet Society says that a key approach to protect online protection is to have strong data protection laws that are technologically neutral, and in Brazil we are moving towards that, and also privacy by design principles in all our products and services, and ethical principles to collect and handle data. And we are certainly going to discuss all the subject. Internet Society says that privacy is important to everyone. It gives dignity and freedom of speech to individuals. Internet Society has the pleasure of being an important partner to the seminar, bringing support and collaboration for 10 years now. ISOC Brazil, the Brazilian chapter of the Internet Society, who I have the pleasure to chair since last year, represents the promotion of principles for the development and use of the Internet that Internet Society has always defended in multiple international scenarios. Data protection and privacy are crucial in our defense. And ISOC Brazil is very happy to be here in this opening panel and in the seminar today and tomorrow, taking active role in the seminar for the protection of the Internet that can have trust, innovation, and respect to everyone's rights. I wish you an excellent seminar, and congratulations CGI and NIC that are represented by the 30 years of .br. Thank you. Thank you, Flávio. Flávio said that one of the partners that has been part of this event for many years, and I want also to highlight the presence of the Federal Prosecutor's Office, Luis Costa, that from the very beginning was part of this event. Luis had an excuse of being away for some years, but he came back more mature and with more experience. Welcome, Luis. Thank you, Professor Gleiser, Dani, Fábio, Marina. Thank you all for attending. First of all, I'd like to remember and thank Demi. I say that it's all his fault for welcoming us and really embracing this idea in 2010. And the role that NIC and CGI have been playing all those years in supporting all those values that in a way contributed to the seminar along the years. That always happens because there was room to embrace the discussions, which is the seminar. I see this that because of the multi-sectorial character of CGI, I think that when we work at a multi-sector level, we are being democratic. And I think this is good for us to remember when we are living harsh times in terms of attacks to our freedom and institutions. The seminar, just to remember a bit of its history, it followed changes in society, laws at the criminal level, the civil landmark of 2014, data protection laws that were most recently passed. So the seminar went through all these changes and provided room for discussions and really fostered I think that's the word. It did foster in the past and fosters today discussions about data protection in Brazil and the development of data protection in Brazil. On my part, and legally speaking, I would like to remind you all of the tension that we had in the passing of data protection laws. We needed a neutral, strong law to protect data. And I think that more than that, we have to see to principles and rights, but also to responsibilities and independent authority. So without these three areas, we cannot have a real law. And we do have a real law today, and what we have to do is to continue moving forward on this aspect. So it's been 10 years, but I feel it's just the beginning of a new phase. And for my final wishes, or perhaps initial wishes, because we're just beginning the seminar, I wish that we have an excellent discussion, that we are able to listen to one another, and that we talk about privacy that is so much so often connected to individualism, but this is not what we want. We want discussion. We want a discussion that is typical of a life in society so that everyone can develop together. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of one more seminar. And I wish you all the best.
Dr. Luiz Costa, muito obrigado pelas palavras e pela presença. Nesse momento,
And right now, representing the coordinator of CGI, Dr. Marciliano Martidão. Unfortunately, he was not able to be here. So I would like to give you a few words about the Managing Committee. As Executive Secretary, we have been involved in promoting this multi-sectorial model of the committee that was created in a decree of 95. And after this many years of activity, it has defended Internet in Brazil, taking part in several efforts connected to the Internet in our country. In the beginning, the Managing Committee activity was in an academic project within FAPESP. It later on became a legal entity with NIC.br. And in the beginning, we have a more technical concern to have a structure of efficiency, quality, high level, to record domain names and allocation of IP addresses. But very soon we found out that Internet is much more than technology and infrastructure. And as I said in my initial remarks, if people think that the Internet is lawless, well, it's not. You are very mistaken. We have developed with legal branches, judicial branches, together with the Federal Prosecutor Office and courts. Just to give you an example, last year we held a symposium about misinformation and fake news in a cooperation with the Superior Voting Court. We had the second seminar this year, and we committed as the Managing Committee to take part of a movement to fight fake news, which unfortunately are spread on the Internet. We really want to help and cooperate to avoid that this evil spreads. And it's upon each one of us to join this effort. I have some brief information. The Managing Committee, as I mentioned, registered domain names, allocates IP addresses. It has a very active department in Internet security and also Internet statistics. What the Internet produces in terms of results, what are its impacts on Brazilian culture, and how the Internet impacts Brazil as a whole. So our statistics center develops measurements and projects with metrics that are acceptable internationally, with values and numbers that are compatible and comparable to other countries. We also have a department that is looking into developing apps and platforms on internet. One of them being accessibility. In Brazil, we still have people with physical limitations that cannot access the internet as most of us. So accessibility is very important. We have about 20% of our population with some kind of physical limitation to access the internet. So we have a group that focuses on using WTC standards in this area. Another group focusing on engineering, infrastructure, and quality of the internet, measuring how services are provided. And that many times makes us talk to telephone operators, Anatel, and other government agencies. These are efforts that are important, and also our internet participation. Brazil has been an important player in the international arena, participating and organizing 2 ICANN events, 2 IGFs, when we signed the civil landmark, which was a major contribution for the managing committee. And 10 years ago, we had our first recommendations, our decalogue, which are the recommendations that are today part of the civil framework. So we had many contributions, and we want to continue participating in the establishment of strategic guidelines to develop Brazilian internet. It is with this intent that CGI supports events in several areas, including the legal area. We are going to have a major event in the beginning of October. We are going to have the forum in Manaus, but we also will have a meeting of FIAD, which is an Ibero-American meeting of judges and lawyers in São Paulo to discuss the internet. We are partners of this event, and together we want to contribute for Brazil to continue to be a leader in the internet worldwide. So on behalf of CGI, on behalf of Marciliano Martinhão, once again, I want to welcome you. Thanks for the opening panel. Thanks for attending. And I wish you all a great, efficient work on the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, that you can establish dialogue, contribute, and learn, and that you continue to move forward. I wish you all the best on these 2 days. Thank you.
Declaro encerrada, então, a mesa e vamos passar para o primeiro palestrante. Se assume.
Isso, agradecemos a participação.
We would like to thank all the participants at this panel. Thank you so much. Mr. Costa will stay as he will moderate our next session, which is rethinking personal data protection in a globalized society moved by data. And for that, I would like to invite our special guest, Orla Lendsky, who is an associated professor by the Law University of LSE Law, LSE.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here, to see such a big crowd, so congratulations to the organisers, and thank you for inviting me. It is, as I said, a very big pleasure to be here, but I've also just had a wonderful 10-day holiday in Brazil, so hopefully I won't be too rusty and will remember some data protection. The topic of my talk this morning is rethinking the foundations of data protection law. Or, as you can see from this slide, I've reworked that slightly to call it data protection through the looking glass. And so, for those of you who are literary fans, you'll know that in the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, the book by Lewis Carroll, Alice goes through the looking glass to a parallel world where everything is inverted or turned on its head. And in essence, what I want to suggest this morning is that having had almost 50 years of experience in Europe with data protection and 25 years in the EU, it's time for us to turn data protection on its head. And so, in particular, I want to make three main claims. So, the first is that core data protection principles, which you see replicated in the Brazilian law, remain solid and sound in a digital era, but they are put under a lot of pressure due to the exponential increase in personal data processing that we see, what Fleur Johns has called the data deluge. So we're faced with a tsunami of data, and this is putting pressure on data protection rules. As a result, I think we need to see two changes happen in terms of data protection legislation. One is an internal change to data protection law, and that is a move away from the idea of putting pressure on individuals to take responsibility for their own data, owning their data, exercising their rights, and instead putting emphasis on the enforcement of data protection rules and on the responsibilities of data protection controllers. And I think there are some mechanisms in the Brazilian law for this, but also a lot more mechanisms in the General Data Protection Regulation, or the EU's GDPR, on this. Because I would say, in addition to looking through the looking glass, if we look backwards in Europe, the biggest flaw we have seen with data protection law is that while the law on the books is very solid, the law in practice has been very ineffective. And I'll talk through some of the reasons why it has been so ineffective in practice over the course of this discussion. But the third claim I want to make is that in addition to turning data protection on its head and putting more emphasis on strategic enforcement, we also need to look beyond data protection regulation to other areas of law, potentially regulation around consumer protection, but equally what I will talk about today is competition law and data-driven mergers and the impact that that then has on rights like data protection and privacy. And so I think it's only when you look at this big picture that you can kind of deliver effective data protection. So this morning I will speak to you quite a bit about the EU data protection framework. Firstly, because that's where I have expertise, but secondly, because I think the Brazilian law aligns very clearly with the rights-based regimes, data protection regimes, that you see indicated here on the slide. So I've recently completed a big piece of comparative work on global data protection regimes, and you can see that broadly speaking, you can divide systems into rights-based models, which are founded on fundamental rights and give individuals rights, and more economic models, where the primary aim is to ensure the free flow of personal data. And of course, these aren't completely separate aims, because the GDPR and Convention 108 also seek to ensure the free flow of data, but it's about where emphasis is put. And reading through the Brazilian law, I would suggest that it falls more into the rights-based camp of data protection frameworks. The other reason why I think the European experience could be relevant and could provide some kind of cautionary tales for the Brazilian law is because the basic framework of the system is the same as the GDPR. And so if you look at the Brazilian law, what you see is that it applies broadly to personal data, which is processed. So it applies to all personal data processing with quite limited exceptions. And it doesn't prevent personal data processing, Rather, it allows personal data processing, provided that you keep in mind some safeguards. One of the interesting ones in the Brazilian framework is good faith. You keep in mind some safeguards, and that you show you have a legal justification. That could be consent, but that could be contract, or the public interest, or legitimate interests. And so in this way, you see that it's a kind of system of checks and balances. And in that system of checks and balances, it gives rights to individuals and places responsibilities on data controllers. And so in this sense, again, the Brazilian law is very much aligned to modernized Convention 108 from the Council of Europe and the EU General Data Protection Regulation in its scheme. So then looking at the European experience, well, you could see that the first European law at EU level was introduced in 1995. And following a very contentious legislative process with an awful lot of lobbying, more so than any other piece of EU legislation in history, the GDPR was adopted in 2016 and entered into force last year. And you see a former European data protection supervisor note that in spite of all of the innovation in the GDPR, the core principles around legal basis, around safeguards, remain the same. So we've retained all of the familiar basic concepts and principles, they continue to exist, but they're subject to some clarifications and small changes. This, I think, in principle is true, but once you dig a little bit further in the GDPR, you can see that actually the core principles surrounding rights and responsibilities haven't changed significantly, but there is a new layer of regulation that is introduced, a new layer of meta-regulation, which I'll come back to later. In particular, the introduction of a principle of accountability. And this is another principle that applies to data controllers in an effort to make them think in a systematic, organizational way about how to protect personal data. So that's an additional layer of protection, which you also see in the Brazilian law, but which didn't exist in the previous generation of European data protection laws. And building on top of that, you see stronger enforcement mechanisms, significant administrative fines, up to 4% of annual global turnover. And that was really, of course, what grabbed the headlines. But beyond that, there are some smaller enforcement mechanisms that are likely to make a bigger difference. In particular, the introduction of collective redress, and I'll come back to that again later. So you can see that the Brazilian law shares quite a lot in common with these European data protection frameworks. It's rights-based, it's based on a system of checks and balances, and it has adopted all of the innovations that you see in the most recent kind of round of legislative change in the EU. So why then do I ask us to rethink the foundations of data protection law? Well, one thing which I think you see quite clearly in the GDPR is references to its fundamental rights status. And that, I think, has increased since 1995. And the reason why I say that is that in 2009, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights acquired binding force. And so this is a charter of rights which contains not only a right to respect for private life, but in addition, a right to data protection. Now, this might seem natural to you, but such a right, for instance, exists in some constitutions in Europe, the Portuguese constitution and the Slovenian constitution, for example. But in other countries, I'm Irish, in Ireland, for instance, this is a very foreign concept. The idea that data protection is anything more than a compliance issue. So to consolidate it as a right starts to beg some interesting questions. What is the added value of this right beyond the right to privacy or the right to respect for private life? What does this right do that privacy does not? And so in thinking about this, if I revert to the text of the right, you'll see that it sets out a general principle. Everyone has the right to respect for private life. It also identifies some elements of data protection law and points to them. So, for instance, the idea that data must be fairly processed, the idea that you need to have a legal basis. It identifies the right of access to data. But what about other rights, such as the right to delete data? Do they not have a fundamental right status? What are we to infer from the provision's silence as to these other rights in the data protection framework? And then I think what is probably quite interesting from a Brazilian perspective is that compliance has to be ensured by an independent authority. And that is an element of the Charter right to data protection. So that procedural element is as important as the substantive rules in the data protection framework. So this has provoked a lot of discussion about what we want from this right to data protection. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights refers to the essence of each and every right. So the first question is, well, what is the essence of the right to data protection? And here I think people split into two camps. The Court of Justice of the EU, so the highest court, has indicated that this could be data security. So how might that work in practice? Well, you might, for instance, have a government force a company to ensure that encrypted technologies have a backdoor that can be routed around when law enforcement wants access to data. Well, that, you could argue, violates the essence of the right to data protection by impacting on data security. But others argue that the essence of data protection is the idea of informational self-determination. And this is what I want to focus on today, because this is something that's also mentioned in Article 2 of the Brazilian law. So informed self-determination and the concepts of dignity and personality are referred to. So how attached should we be to that concept of informed self-determination? Well, you can see, as I said, that there are other key elements just outside of the core of the right to data protection, which are mentioned in the right, in Article 8, and then others which are not mentioned at all. So one of the big questions in the coming years will be, what exactly is this right to data protection, and how will it impact the interpretation of this legal framework? But as I said, there is a right to data protection in addition to a right to privacy. And so in thinking about how to separate these two things out, you can think of elements of privacy that relate in no way to data. So for instance, physical privacy. Somebody standing at your window and looking at you getting out of the shower relates in no way to data if that's not recorded in any way, if it's just a simple peeping Tom kind of privacy violation. So that would be a violation of the right to respect for private life, but not a violation of the right to data protection. But the question is, are there things that would breach the right to data protection that wouldn't constitute a privacy violation? And here I think, and I apologize because this is my poor use of PowerPoint, but these rights are in fact very heavily overlapping. So this picture is kind of inaccurate. I just couldn't make them overlap anymore. So these rights are in fact now almost completely overlapping. But yet, if you look at data protection law, you see that it guarantees protection for more types of information than the right to respect for private life, because ordinarily it applies to data which has been made public. And I note that in the Brazilian law, you don't need consent for data processing when it has been manifestly made public by the data subject, which I think is going to be a very, very contentious provision in the law. Because when can we say in a digital context that you've manifestly made something public? But the other safeguards in the law apply. So the rules give protection, and the right gives protection to publicly available data, whereas the right to respect for private life often requires a reasonable expectation of privacy in a particular situation. But the other way I think data protection is perhaps broader is that it gives individuals rights to control their data in circumstances which would not exist under privacy law. The clear example of this in the Brazilian law and in the EU law is the right to data portability. My right to switch data providers or cloud computing providers or email providers isn't something that is intrinsically linked to my private life, but it is intrinsically linked to my ability to control my data. Which is why, if you look at the GDPR, we start to see a lot of references to control over personal data. So there are some explicit references in the GDPR, which didn't exist previously. So just one example here in one of the recitals, which are the non-binding provisions at the beginning. You see that a personal data breach, if not addressed, can cause material and non-material damages, such as a loss of control over personal data. So this is referred to time and again, the need for individuals to be able to control their personal data. But I think more importantly, it is implicit in many of the provisions in the GDPR. And so if we think of the idea of control, I think we instinctively think of consent. But of course, that's a fallacy in the Brazilian and the GDPR, the Brazilian law and the GDPR, because consent is only one legal basis. You don't always need to have consent. You can rely on another legitimate reason for processing personal data. So consent is one manifestation of this informational self-determination, but I think that this is more obvious when you look at the bundle of micro-rights. And this is a term used by Daniel Lemaitre, a French researcher, where he says, the GDPR gives you a bundle of micro-rights over your personal information. And again, you see these in the Brazilian law. The right to access, the right to delete, the right to port your information. In the EU, very controversially, the right to be forgotten. And all of these are mini manifestations of this idea of control over personal data. And as I said, the charter right itself, when you look at the wording, it doesn't mention informational self-determination, but it does seem to be heavily influenced by a decision of the German Constitutional Court in 1983, which was based on the constitutional rights to dignity and personality in the German Basic Law, and it extracted this right to informational self-determination from those constitutional rights. So all in all, what you see is an increased emphasis on control over personal data by individuals in the General Data Protection Regulation. And I think that's replicated to a large extent in the Brazilian law. However, I would urge some caution about this because, as is by now well documented, control is, I think, a necessary element of data protection law, but it is not a sufficient element of data protection law. And by that I mean that we can't rely on individuals to control their own data. The reason why I say this is twofold. So first of all, we can imagine a whole series of practical reasons why we can't control our own data. So, sorry, but before saying that, I guess, pushed to its logical conclusion, the idea of control over personal data would bring us close to a property right in personal data. And that is categorically not what the EU data protection framework gives. Although, again, I do note that Article 17 of the Brazilian law speaks of ownership of data. And initially, when the GDPR was adopted, the commissioners, the political commissioners responsible for its adoption spoke of ownership of data. But it seems those results are very hard to find, or those statements are very hard to find on the internet now, because they realize that, in fact, the law doesn't give you ownership over data, it gives you control in certain limited circumstances. And so if you look to business models that you see emerging, well, across the world really, so kind of personal information management systems, and this is a quite extreme example called Commodify. This is the idea that you can take your data and sell it online. So you can see here you save your data, they analyze your data, and then you license your data to them. So they're not claiming it's an ownership model, it's more like an intellectual property right that you have over your data. But again, here I think we need to be quite cautious in thinking about these business models. Why? Because the concept of informational self-determination is not absolute. You can give your data to this type of company, but you can continue to exercise your right to delete at any point in time. So what you give, you can take away. And so these business models are founded on quite an unstable legal basis, because equally if the legal basis is consent, you can revoke consent. And it is not in many ways your data to give away because of that lack of ownership right. And so you see here that then there's a tension in the idea of informational self-determination, because on the one hand, it wants to facilitate autonomy of the individual and give individuals control over their data, but on the other hand, there are paternalistic limits to that control. And that, I think, is very much in keeping with the European human rights tradition. There's a great case about dwarf throwing that I won't go into. So, in addition, we, I think, will all be very familiar with a number of very practical limits to control over data. So, one example is the very lengthy terms and conditions that we encounter in the digital environment. And so you can pick your study to illustrate that this makes it improbable, if not implausible, for individuals to actually read privacy policies. But the Norwegian Consumer Council picked the 33 most popular consumer apps that individuals in Norway have on their phones, and if you have some time on your hands, you can visit YouTube or a similar streaming channel and see them read these aloud for 24 hours, where they said that if you took these terms and conditions, their combined length was longer than the New Testament. So, again, you know, unlikely that individuals are actually going to take the time to digest and to read these types of terms and conditions. We also have an increasing body of literature around the idea of dark patterns. And so here, again, the work of the Norwegian Consumer Council, which is an excellent report called Deceived by Design, and also the work of Privacy International in their recent report on this, is fantastic. So this is the idea that the way in which we are presented with choices in the digital environment often involves a very strong nudge in one direction, what Karen Young calls a hyper nudge. So where you have to click through to several screens in order to actually see which vendors are going to get access to your data and to change the cookie policy, for instance. Or where the accept button, normally it comes under some sort of sign saying, we value your privacy, accept, in a big green flashing light, and then in small grey letters you can see reject. So these types of dark patterns make it, again, more difficult for individuals, not impossible, but more difficult for individuals to exercise informed choice. And then something which I'll come back to later, the way in which the internet ecosystem is currently structured makes it hard to avoid certain platforms. I was having a very nice lunch and I wanted to access some internet, and I found that the only way to access internet in this fantastic restaurant in Rio was to sign up through Facebook. It so happens that I am a conscientious objector when it comes to Facebook. But you can see that in these circumstances, a lot of our sign-ins in a digital context, a lot of our social interactions occur through platforms that are owned by very few enterprises. And so this has provoked a big debate that I'll talk about later. This was the subject of a speech given by the Competition Commissioner in the EU, Margrethe Vestager, who is about to become the Vice President of the European Commission, at a workshop in Cambridge earlier this year, where she said, data gives us power. Power we can use in good ways to save resources, to find new solutions, to help us live happier and more fulfilling lives. So this is an exciting moment. But it is also a moment when we have choices to make about who gets to use that power. And so in that speech, she discussed the consolidation of data power in the digital environment. Another way, another factor that makes it more difficult for individuals to exercise control. And then we also see things like cookie walls. So this is the idea that if you don't want your personal data to be processed and you want to access some content online, that you need to consent in order to access that content. So this Washington Post business model attracted a lot of attention in Europe and a huge debate following the entry into force of the GDPR. Because we all know that digital content, in particular high quality journalism, is not free. Yet, we have become accustomed to free in the digital environment, and so here they gave users a choice. You could have this content without paying a monetary price, but the quid pro quo for that was that you gave them access to your data, and they were allowed to process your personal data. Or you could pay for a basic subscription which involved less data processing. And the reason why this provoked such fierce debate was, on the one hand, people said, well, this is just a market response to the legislation. Others said, well, this is making people pay for a fundamental right. So if the quantity of data that they extract for the free service is excessive, then in order to avoid that, you are basically paying for protection of a fundamental right. And so this is a debate which kind of rages on. And so in the academic literature, you have some researchers in the Netherlands, in particular Frederick Borgesius, who's an expert in all things online advertising, saying that the GDPR doesn't in fact ban these types of tracking walls. However, he and colleagues argue that it should in particular circumstances. And so they say if you're dealing with a dominant company, if you're dealing with a monopoly, then services shouldn't be offered on a take it or leave it basis. Or if you're dealing with vulnerable individuals, so for instance, a national healthcare service requiring that you have tracking in order to get advice around drug addiction or something similar, or gambling addiction, whatever it is. In those circumstances, this type of unconditional processing shouldn't be allowed. But this is about to become a very hot topic in the EU, and the reason for that is if you look at the wording of the GDPR, it actually tries to address this. But in doing so, I think it makes a mess of it because it's not very clear. So it says, like the Brazilian laws, that consent has to be informed, it has to be specific, and it has to be freely given. And the question with something like this, is this freely given consent? Can we say it's freely given consent? And what the GDPR says about that is, when you are assessing whether consent is freely given, you have to take utmost account of whether or not that consent, or the performance of a contract, so access to something like the Washington Post, is made conditional on giving that consent. So we're about to face a situation where a court will have to decide how much data is necessary for the performance of a contract. Is it kind of all the data? Will we place no limits on this? Or will we say this amount of data is a reasonable profit or a reasonable return on investment for the service that you are providing? It so happens that this is a question that is pending before the European Court of Justice at this moment. And I think this is interesting for a few reasons. This is interesting because it's 2019 and we've had data protection rules in the EU since 1995, and it's taken us this long to ask this question. But I think it's also interesting because the advisor to the court, the Advocate General, explicitly endorses the idea that data is payment in the digital environment, which I think will upset those looking at this from a fundamental rights perspective. But also in the context of this case, so let me just explain this case to you briefly. This was a case about a free online lottery service. So the prize wasn't particularly significant. So it was free online. And if you signed up to the lottery service, there was one box in particular that you had to click in order to gain access to the lottery. And by clicking on that box, you consented to either choosing 30 commercial partners from a list of 57 who would contact you by email or by post or by phone, or if you didn't bother to choose the 30 partners you would hear from, the company would choose, the company Planet 49 running the lottery would choose them for you. So the quid pro quo for access to the lottery was giving your data to 30 commercial companies. And so what does the Advocate General say about this? Well, he says, we have to keep in mind that the underlying purpose of participation in the lottery is the selling of personal data. In other words, it is the providing of personal data which constitutes the main obligation of users to participate in the lottery. And so he thinks that in this situation, the processing of the personal data is necessary to participate in the lottery. However, I think we could discuss the proportionality of asking for your contact details to be given to 30 providers to enter into the chance, a lottery, to obtain quite a small prize. But he doesn't engage in that analysis at all. So it's questionable how protective this supposedly robust new principle on consent will be. So you can see that all of these mechanisms are then putting pressure on control over personal data. And so there are those practical limitations to informational self-determination, but there are also normative or conceptual limitations to control over personal data. And the most obvious one is the balancing of data protection rights and the individual's right to control their information with freedom of expression. And you see this made clear in the right to be forgotten, or the right to delete, as I think it should more accurately be referred. And so in a recent case in the UK, called NT1 and NT2, you could see that the court in the UK said these two rights have to be put on the same scale, put on the scales with the same weight. One doesn't trump or prevail over the other. So it says the balancing exercise in any individual delisting case, so to remove information from a search result, is to be entered into with the scales in equal balance. And so you can see that if you gave individuals absolute control over personal data, that equal balancing wouldn't be possible. Another limit, another conceptual limit to individual control over personal data stems from the fact that that doesn't recognize group privacy. It doesn't recognize the fact that data can relate to many individuals simultaneously. So you think of something as obvious as a joint bank account, or perhaps even more prosaically, a telephone call. The metadata about that telephone call doesn't just relate to one individual, it relates to two. So the more control you give individuals over their information, the more clashes and tensions you're going to have over these competing claims for that personal data. And I think Lynette Taylor talks about, so there's been some fantastic work done on group privacy, but Lynette Taylor in the Netherlands has been one of the pioneers here. And she kind of argues that technologies, new technologies, sort, profile, and inform action based on groups. Based on group dynamics. Are you wealthy? Are you educated? Are you likely to have a heart attack? Are you interested in travel? So we're sorted and profiled into groups rather than necessarily profiled at an individual level. And so she argues that in order to operationalize or put in place any meaningful concept of data justice, we have to look beyond the individual. And so what I'm suggesting is that legislation that kind of consolidates the role of the individual ignores this collective dimension. And again, I think portability is, as I said, a great example of this. I'm running short on time, so I won't go into this in much detail, but just to highlight one or two things. Portability, including data portability, depends on the initiative of the individual. And in other areas of law, for instance, utilities, gas, electricity, we have quite a bit of empirical evidence to now show that it is people who have sufficient income who tend to actually switch and move between providers, and that those who have less income pay a kind of a poverty premium by not switching. And so there is a query here about what will happen with data protection. If we have data portability, will it be those informed, savvy consumers, well-educated, with resources, financial and time on their hands, that exercise this right, rather than the general population? So who will this benefit? So it's a very individualized approach to protection. And then we also have some feasibility challenges. So as I said, just even carving out your personal data from somebody else's personal data if you want to port it from one service provider to another. Another thing I noted about the Brazilian law when compared to the GDPR is that the right to data portability is in many ways broader because it applies to all data, whereas the EU law only applies to data that is provided by the individual. But we can perhaps talk about that later. Sorry. And so here, what I wanted to show you in too much time is the limits, or are the limits of individual control over personal data. As I said, I'm following in a long line of academics to discuss this, but I think Julie Cohn, a US academic, has put this very nicely when she says, we need to turn privacy inside out. So she said, privacy rights are supposed to protect individual subjects, and so conventional ways of understanding privacy are very subject-centered, but these subject-centered approaches wrestle with these deeply embedded contradictions that I've been talking about. And so privacy's most enduring institutional failure is to not recognize this. So I want to just kind of pick up on that and highlight some ways in which we can move past this individualistic approach to data protection and ensure effective data protection through more collective mechanisms, through more systemic rather than collective mechanisms. So if we shift away from the individual, that's not to say that you remove the individual from the picture, it's just that you take the emphasis or the responsibility off the individual for protecting their rights. I think you can recalibrate or make this shift in two ways. One is internal to data protection law, and you can do that in a number of ways. We could, for instance, have narrower data protection laws, more focused on particular harms, for instance, or more focused on particular types of data processing operations. And that might lead to more effective rights, and I'll point you to the debate on this at the moment. We could introduce a new layer of regulatory techniques, as we've done, around accountability and risk. Or we could see stronger enforcement. And as I said, this has been the big problem in Europe. And some of that has been rectified by the GDPR. So, for instance, the fragmentation of the application of the rules may be rectified by the creation of a new EU-level agency, which can issue binding decisions. And that won't be an issue in Brazil because you will hopefully have a centralized authority. But also other things around sanctions and selective enforcement. But looking beyond data protection, we could also see a role for other areas of law, as I said, like competition law. So the first thing to consider is whether or not our data protection laws are too broad. And as a result, that makes them very difficult to enforce. And this is an argument that is being increasingly made in the EU. So Nadia Portova, a scholar in the Netherlands, has called data protection the law of everything. So she says the problem is that in the circumstances where all data is personal data, because the definition of personal data is so broad, any information relating to somebody who is identified or identifiable, so almost identical to the Brazilian definition, this triggers data protection law. And then you have a whole raft of obligations that then apply that are not necessarily scalable in terms of how they apply in practice. And so she says the result is that the GDPR can't then be applied in a meaningful way. What is interesting is that this is now being considered, again, before the Court of Justice of the EU. So we have a case pending called GC and others. So it's a whole eight individuals from France, all of whom have had their sensitive personal data returned as search results in Google's search engine. And so they argue that when their sensitive data appears in Google's search engine, this is Google processing sensitive data, and that it needs to either obtain their explicit consent, which it hasn't done, or have one of the other more restrictive justifications for processing sensitive data. So the Brazilian law, like the GDPR, contains more restrictive provisions for sensitive data. And the question is, how could Google search engine continue to do what it does by distinguishing between sensitive personal data and non-sensitive personal data? When something like an image can contain sensitive personal data, of course. So what has the court said about this? Well, the court hasn't had the opportunity to discuss it yet, but again, the advisor to the court is recommending something quite unusual. So he says, when the directive was drafted in 1995, search engines weren't kind of present in the legislator's mind. And so its provisions do not lend themselves to an intuitive and purely literal application to search engines. Okay, let's forget the fact that the GDPR was enacted in 2016 when search engines did exist. But so he argues that we can't take an all or nothing approach to the application of data protection rules to search engines. So he says it is necessary to examine each provision from the aspect or from the perspective of whether or not it is capable of being applied to search engines. So this is really quite interesting. What he is proposing is that you go through the law provision by provision and say, can this provision meaningfully apply to that data controller? You can imagine the immediate objections. This renders the application of the law quite uncertain. Yet, he's trying to deal with the practical problem, which is that the business model doesn't fit with the law because of the law's broad scope and restrictive provisions. Similarly, we've seen the concept of data controller, which also exists in the Brazilian law, interpreted very expansively. So one recent example is in a case called Facebook fan pages, where the operators of a fan page on Facebook, so where businesses, for instance, can connect with consumers, or local swimming club can connect with members of the club, or whatever it is, have been deemed to be joint controllers for the purposes of data protection law. So co-responsible with Facebook for the application of the data protection rules. And the justification given by the court for this was that the fan page received data analytics from Facebook, and it chose what type of data analytics it wanted. So do you want information on gender? Do you want information on age? Do you want information on geographic location? What kind of aggregate information would you like? And so as a result, it became a co-controller. But this, again, has led an advocate general at the court to say, will effective protection be enhanced if everyone is responsible for ensuring it? So the more people we make responsible under the law, the less effective the law might become. And so what he says, and this is really quite a striking opinion because he's very critical, he says that the conceptual lack of clarity upstream about who is a data controller and with regard to what aspect of the data processing activities is leading to a lack of clarity downstream for individuals about where they can exercise their rights. And he says this crosses into the realm of actual impossibility. So you now have members of the European Court of Justice talking about the actual impossibility of applying this law. Keeping in mind that's the law that has been broadly replicated, not simply in Brazil, but globally. And so we're going to need to have a more sustained conversation about the scope of application of this law and whether or not it delivers effective data protection. So one thing we could do is reconsider the scope. Another thing we could do, more mundane, is emphasize the responsibilities of controllers through what has been called meta-regulation. So not co-regulation, but the idea that controllers take responsibility to comply with the rules and that then they can demonstrate that compliance. And in order to make this really effective, you would want to have that compliance demonstrated not simply to authorities, but also to interested members of civil society, to interested members of the public, to interested stakeholders. I'm really running out of time, so I'm not going to go into that, but you can see that this has been introduced in the GDPR, in the Brazilian law, and you also see references to risk, that you should in some ways calibrate the extent of your obligations, what measures you take to ensure data protection compliance, by taking into account what type of risk the data processing operation will entail. So I think what you can see here with the introduction of accountability and risk is an attempt to address the problem of the broad scope of the law. So you're trying to introduce scalable obligations, but not necessarily labeling it as such. But I think most importantly in the EU context at least, and I can imagine it will be the same here, is enforcement of the law. Because globally we have seen a huge proliferation of data protection laws, but many of them haven't been enforced. And I think the same stands true for the European Union, which is looked at as, I guess, one of the leaders in this area. Why hasn't it been enforced? Well, inadequate resources, limited and fragmented regulatory actions, and in some situations, regulatory competition between the states, where everyone wants to regulate particular actors, in particular the big tech companies. Up until now, we've seen a limited role of civil society, although I think that will change. And the idea of selective enforcement is still quite contested. So the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, keeping in mind that in Europe, most of the tech companies are based in Ireland, so that would have the lead for investigating data protection compliance. She got in a lot of, was subject to a lot of criticism for speaking about digital ambulance chasers. So she said, that her office had been inundated with requests for declaratory statements that the law had been violated. Even when the data processing infringement had ceased, the data controller had recognized that they had been in the wrong, but people wanted these declaratory judgments, and she had to, through her mandate, look at each and every complaint and investigate each and every complaint. So she didn't have the opportunity to engage in selective enforcement. And so she said that this was dragging attention away from the large-scale systemic breaches that were affecting, a vast swathe of the population, to focus on these smaller individual complaints. And I think that's an issue that is, again, currently being discussed in Europe. Should we be selective in order to be more effective in the enforcement capacity? Something which is already, I think, very well established in Brazil, but is not in Europe, is the idea of collective redress. So the possibility for civil society actors to take litigation on behalf of individuals. And this is now something that the GDPR introduces. So just very briefly, what you can see there are three mechanisms to potentially shift the emphasis in data protection law, away from individual control towards more effective data protection. But those mechanisms are internal to the law. What I want to do with my last 5 minutes is to just highlight an ongoing discussion about mechanisms beyond data protection law that can actually help individuals have more effective data protection rights. And so across the world, I think it's accurate to say. So this week we've had a report from the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission. We've had reports from the FTC in the US. And earlier this year we've had a report both from the EU and the UK Competition and Markets Authority. You see that competition authorities are becoming more and more interested in competition in data-driven markets. So you might be saying, how is this in any way relevant to data protection and privacy? Well, I think if you go back to what I mentioned earlier, the consolidation of data in the hands of fewer and fewer actors online, you can see that we are, I think, in a situation of data power, where a handful of commercial enterprises hold an awful lot of data, and with that data, they can both potentially gain a competitive advantage, but also have power over individuals because data is power. And so the question is, how did we get here? How have we ended up with a consolidation of data in the hands of very few actors? And here we can point to a number of factors, and I'm happy to discuss these in Q&A, but the one I want to talk about is mergers and acquisitions. So since 2009, we have seen a huge number, up to 4 or 5 a week, of acquisitions by a handful of digital actors of nascent startups. So some of the most famous are, for instance, Google's acquisition of Nest, the home heating device for the Internet of Things. And if you look at this type of transaction, it's not something that would attract the attention of a competition authority. Why? Because a competition authority would say, well, Google is an online operator with a search engine, with Gmail, or whatever it is, and Nest is a home heating device. And so if these two companies merge, this doesn't reduce competition because they're not competing at the moment. Nest is a home heating device that is not competing with Google's search engine. And so in this way, these transactions have kind of flown under the radar to a significant extent, with some exceptions. So one that did attract quite a lot of attention was Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp. Keeping in mind that this occurred after Facebook's acquisition of Instagram and Lenovo and various other potential competitors. And so this transaction was brought to the attention of the European Commission, and the European Commission passed the merger, or approved the merger, while attaching no conditions. And its logic was that on the relevant markets, and they were social networking, where WhatsApp wasn't relevant or wasn't active, only Facebook was, online advertising, where WhatsApp wasn't active, only Facebook was, and consumer communications. These guys were not direct competitors, and in the market where they were direct competitors, so consumer communications, the fact that WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook didn't limit competition because sufficient competition still existed. The logic of the Commission was that consumers multi-home. We don't just have one app on our phones for communication, we tend to have several on our phones, and therefore this acquisition wasn't problematic. However, several competition scholars, in particular Ariel Ezraki at the University of Oxford, have argued that the Commission kind of missed the point here. What fell in the blind spot of the Commission's analysis was the data, was the potential for WhatsApp and Facebook to aggregate the data. And of course, Facebook gave the European Commission information to suggest that it wasn't technically possible for it to merge this data. And then it transpired that it was technically possible for it to merge this data, and it was fined by the European Commission, but the deal was done, quite literally. So why do I mention this in a data protection context? Well, when individuals were asked to express their choice as to whether or not they wanted to have their WhatsApp data transferred to Facebook, this was the dark pattern that was encountered. And I take this from Pat Walsh, a privacy consultant in the UK for a group called Privacy Matters. And Pat Walsh had kind of gone through the options that were given to individuals, and you can see here that the language is quite unclear. Your information will be shared with the Facebook family of companies. This will be some of your account information, your phone number. And for any of you that are users of Facebook, you might know that unless you download the Messenger app on your phone, you don't necessarily have to hand over your phone number. Your phone number is not necessarily information you provide. So what this allowed was the merger of details about your, dare I say it, real friends, who your actual contacts were, what their numbers are, who you're actually in touch with your Facebook friends, which is a big missing piece of the picture that was allowed through this transaction. And so what I'm suggesting here is that by looking at these mergers from a purely competition perspective, we're missing part of the story. And we're allowing for the further consolidation of the digital environment in a way that renders it even more difficult for data protection law to be effective. And just one last thing to highlight on this. Sorry, I'll flick through this a bit more quickly. But another way in which competition law is starting to think about data protection is as part of the general backdrop to these types of mergers. So, in Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn, but also in an earlier merger or acquisition by Google of a French healthcare company called Sanofi, the Commission said, well, the merger of the data isn't a problem. Why? Because individuals have data portability. So you can see what's happening here. So if you look at this quote, this is from the European Commission decision in Google Sanofi. The Commission says, the lack of ability to lock in patients' sensitive personal data by limiting or preventing the portability of their data won't be possible given that GDPR gives users the right to have their data ported to another company. So what we're saying is let them merge, let Google acquire the healthcare company because individuals can then port their data afterwards. So you can see competition law putting pressure on individual control over personal data. I'm not kind of arguing that competition law should be used to solve data protection problems. What I'm arguing is that competition law shouldn't create data protection problems. I think that's a subtle but important difference. So how could competition law do this? Well, it could, when looking at media mergers, it could look at data protection as an element of the overall quality of a product. So it could say if you allow these companies to merge, we'll see less choice on the market and lower quality products because privacy-preserving products might disappear in this process. But equally, I think another way in which we could look at this that has been considered in the UK is to look at data-driven mergers separately to the competition analysis. So you see this for media mergers in the context of journalism. So if two newspapers want to merge, there's a competition assessment of the merger to see what impact the transaction has on competition. But there is also, in some circumstances, a parallel assessment of the impact of the merger on freedom of speech and media plurality. And that is designed to protect fundamental rights in the competitive process. And so what we could start to consider is a similar data protection assessment or privacy assessment of these types of data-driven mergers in order to promote the rights to data protection and privacy. So what I've argued for too long is that individual control is a necessary part of data protection legislation. But looking in the rear-view mirror in Europe, what you can see is that it has not been sufficient. So it needs to be coupled with active civil society and collective redress and active enforcement of the data protection rules. This might also lead us to consider the scope of the rules and whether and how we can more effectively enforce. So would we have more effective enforcement if the scope of the rules were narrower? The other part of the picture, which I think we can no longer ignore though, is the role of competition in data-driven markets and the impact that the lack of competition upstream is having on the effectiveness of data protection rights downstream. So I'll be looking forward to to discussing that puzzle with you. The last thing I want to say is that I'm one of the editors of a journal called International Data Privacy Law, and as the title suggests, it's an international data privacy journal published by Oxford University Press, and we are very much hoping to get more contributions from beyond the EU and the US, so we would very much welcome contributions from people attending here today. And if you want to contact me, my email address is there, or you can find me online. So thank you.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Orla. Então nós vamos abrir para as perguntas.
Next, then, shall we open for questions? You may address your questions by the app or here in person. As I'm the moderator, I will warm up the discussion while people are getting prepared for addressing their questions. I'd like to thank you, Orla, for such a rich and brilliant talk. Everything you have raised here, I will highlight some of them. I'll highlight two of them, which is all these problems that we see in the European and Brazilian law, where, first of all, data flow is under some sort of control, and second, that this control will lie over someone's hands. So we have problematic issues which go beyond data protection law. From a traditional standpoint, the collective redress or public civil actions in Brazil, we have some mechanisms which they have some sort of tradition in Brazil that may help in expanding that. Before I go straight to my question about competition law, I'd like to know if anyone has a question or if I can be the first one. No, we have a question. Good morning, my name is Marta. I work in the Citizenship Minister, where there is a file with over 70 million subjects with their personal information, such as school education, address. This is a file which is fed by over 100 municipalities, managed by the state, federal district, and that is shared to several social programs, several utility agencies, public contests. And now I ask myself, from a federal ministry standpoint, what does it mean to have personal data protection as number of users, number of people who feed this database, and the need to share information about vulnerable people with so many people? And when you say, well, someone will be liable for that, just one person, and who will be that person? And if many, how? That represents a problem. And when you say, I do not know if that law can be applied, I do not know myself, and that's the reason why I'm here, to learn a little bit more from you. Thank you. Do you have any specific question? No, actually, it's not really a specific question. I'm just raising that fact. Is the law applied for a situation, for a scenario like ours? I'm talking about here on behalf of the ministry, where we have over 6,000 people working and handling that database, and many others that use that database, when we have information about over 7 million people.
So this is quite a difficult issue, the extent to which states can create this type of database. And I guess the database is created, again, without consent, because consent is not appropriate in these circumstances, but in the public interest. What I would want to know is what the stated purposes of the database are. So why was this information initially collected, and what are its stated purposes now? However, so it's hard to kind of say in the abstract. What I would say is you have seen challenges to this type of database for instance, in India, a very famous challenge in recent years against the Aadhaar database, which was a similar public service database, where it went to the Indian Supreme Court, and by relying on the right to privacy rather than on kind of data protection legislation as such, the database in its entirety was deemed to be illegal. The first fines in Europe have been imposed, or the first finding of a breach of the GDPR by the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has in fact been in relation to a similar database in Ireland. And so we have a public services card, which if you want to access certain public services, so in particular if you're a vulnerable member of society and you want to access benefits, you have to have one of these cards. And there was an attempt to use that database to create a general database of the country. So if you wanted to apply for a passport or an ID card, you had to go through that database. And what is interesting is, at that point, the Data Protection Commissioner declared the database to be illegal because it went beyond its stated purposes, and I think they relied on the principle of fairness, but I would need to check. However, that is currently being appealed. So what you see here is one of the challenges, I think, with data protection legislation, which is that it is a very permissive regime. If you can show you have a legal basis for processing, and that can be something as broad as public interest, and if you can show that, for instance, you process the data for compatible purposes with your stated objectives, and that could be to ensure the fair or accurate distribution of benefits, for instance, then data protection law doesn't necessarily prohibit that. It's simply a regime that puts in place some safeguards. But those safeguards aren't completely insignificant. What you should have for that type of database is an impact assessment, for instance. Consideration of the impact, the risks of having that type of database, and the impact that that would have on consumers, or on citizens rather than consumers in this context. So Bruno's working on this stuff rather than me, but those types of safeguards might be helpful, but data protection law of itself, I don't think will necessarily prohibit this. Yeah.
Thank you, Orla. Alguma outra pergunta? Orla, I'd like to ask you something. If you could please develop a little bit more on possible intersections between data protection law and competition law.
Yeah.
In particular, intellectual property and trade secrets. What's on your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So if we, in terms of the relationship between data protection and intellectual property remains something that, again, despite 25 years of law in Europe, there's very little written on, and we have very little jurisprudence. We have some things with regard to copyright infringement by individuals, but nothing about the trade secrets, for instance, of a company. So what impact would portability, for instance, have on intellectual property? If you look at the GDPR, it says that it is without prejudice to the intellectual property rights of the data controller, but how that will be managed in practice, we simply don't know. Where you see most of the emphasis on, when we're thinking of about that interaction between data protection and competition law, is either in the context of mergers, as I briefly mentioned, or in the context of abuses of market position or abuses of market power. And so this is quite controversial. The idea in competition law is that if you have a position, a monopoly position in a market or a high market share, then special responsibilities attach to you as a commercial entity. And so this means that your behavior, certain acts that you commit or acts that you undertake will be illegal, even though if you didn't have a position of market power, they would be completely lawful. And in Germany, what we've seen recently is an attempt by the competition authority in Germany to argue that Facebook is dominant in the market for social networking services, so it has a position of market power, and that it has abused that position of market power by effectively not complying with the data protection rules. So what had been happening with Facebook in Germany was that non-Facebook users were having some of their data transmitted to Facebook when they visited websites with the Facebook plugin or the like kind of thumbs up attached in the web page, and that data was being transmitted back to Facebook. And so the argument was this was not something where consent had been obtained, and this was not transparent to users. And so the German Competition Authority opted to take that as a competition case rather than as a data protection case. So competition lawyers are very divided on this. Some see it as an evolution of the law, and some see it as a distortion of the founding principles of competition law. I think if it's misused, so to simply say a breach of data protection is a breach of competition would be incorrect. However, I do think there are circumstances where the two legal frameworks overlap and where it might actually be more effective to use competition law as a tool rather than data protection, because it's a bit more flexible, because the sanctions are higher. Is that in some way in bad faith? I don't think so. I think it's just you've got two legal frameworks that can apply to the same issue. I think we encounter that quite a lot as lawyers. And I think the way to argue that is to say, as I said, that competition law is about price, but it is also about ensuring more choice for consumers and better quality products. And if you have a dominant company acting in a way that stamps out choice or that reduces the quality of products, then that is a competition issue as well as a data protection issue. Of course, from an institutional perspective, you couldn't prosecute both, and so these things still need to be ironed out, but that's kind of how I would see the relationship developing.
É uma pergunta. Oi? É uma pergunta da Olivia. Ela questiona: há quanto tempo a União Europeia vem...
For how long has the European Union fostering public policies and public policies related to data protection and internet? And in your opinion, what is the maturity level of legal courts about law enforcement in the European scenario? And if there is any level of legal insecurity, and how to deal with self-determination in that sense?
Quite a few questions in there, so I'll take kind of the first, or I'll kind of try and address the first part of it. So data protection is a bit of an odd policy in the EU because initially the EU didn't want to legislate in this area. And as I mentioned at a seminar yesterday, the EU has no competence to proactively introduce fundamental rights instruments. So the Charter means that it can't breach fundamental rights, but it has no competence to introduce fundamental rights legislation, which might then lead you to say, well, how do we have data protection legislation? The answer to that is that this was introduced as with an economic justification. The argument was that if some EU member states had data protection legislation and if others didn't, this would act as an impediment to the free flow of personal data between those states. And so the EU harmonized and introduced a minimum level of data protection across Europe to ensure that data could flow freely. And that was in 1995. What is interesting, I think, is that in 1995, the free flow of data was kind of ancillary to, or kind of complementary to, other elements of free trade or free movement, like the free movement of workers. So if you were a worker who moved from France to Italy, your data could go with you. But data itself was not a commodity. So I think what has changed now is that data has itself become the commodity. And so it's not simply flowing in an ancillary way. We want data to flow because it has value in and of itself. So this began as an economic policy, but with the introduction of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and with several very, very strong judgments from the European Court of Justice, I think it has moved very much from being an economic policy to becoming something more like a fundamental rights policy. From an international perspective, I think that's quite interesting because this could raise international trade issues. You know, is this a protectionist policy, for instance? That's one question that's been asked. And you have provisions in the GATS at the WTO dealing with that, but we haven't kind of seen this litigated or thrashed out properly yet. So I think I started working on data protection a decade ago now, and when I started to write about it, there were very few judgments. It was quite nice, because there were 10 judgments, so there was not much reading, but also just went to show that the law hadn't really been applied. As you probably gathered from the slides today, over the past few months, we've had a huge flurry of judgments. So the maturity of the EU courts is about to, I think, really exponentially increase. I think we're about to have an awful lot more jurisprudence at EU level. We still don't have very much jurisprudence, though, at national level, because of a lack of awareness of the law, because a lot of the rights were given to individuals and there was nobody to help them to exercise them, and because consumer protection and non-profit organisations weren't really well versed in data protection. But again, I think that's changing. So I think we'll see a lot more activism and private litigation at national level as well.
Hi, Orla. Thanks for the terrific lecture, and thanks for coming as well. My question is about this new shape of regulatory mentality in the field of data protection, which is meta-regulation, as you said. And I'd like to hear your thoughts more about this dynamic, this regulatory dynamic, let's say. Meta-regulation puts a lot of faith in the actions of data controller. So basically, who is going to process personal data is the first one that is going to raise the voice regarding how to manage, how to recognize, and how to mitigate the risks of data processing. And one of the best examples of that is data protection impact assessment, but also regarding the legal base for lawful data processing, such as legitimate interest and also regarding the legitimate interest assessment. So when you are talking about this, we are talking just about the content of the regulation, but also have to take in consideration the context of the regulation. And in this sense, when you quote the professor Julia Cohen, that express says that you have to take into account the institution design that is going to put this legislation, this law in movement, do you think, taking into the consideration the EU scenario and also regarding to development countries, this meta-regulation at the end of the day is going to reinforce the asymmetry of information and reinforce the asymmetry of power, or is going to find a balance and to reduce the asymmetry of information and reduce the asymmetry of power?
Nice, easy question. The honest answer is I don't know. I think we could be, so I'm struggling to find any kind of consensus in the academic literature, at least, about the effectiveness of these principles. And in some ways, it's also very difficult to gauge without a lot of research on the ground. And as I said, these principles are new to the European framework as well. And I think in other legal frameworks where you have, for instance, accountability as a principle, so where it's very well established, if I think of the APEC legal framework, the Asia Pacific legal framework, you see that there's a principle of accountability, but no enforcement. So I don't think that's a good comparator. So one answer, I think, is we'll need to see a little bit of, with a little bit of time. If we were to be cynical about the new elements of meta-regulation, and I think Lee Bygrave addresses this very nicely in a lecture which you can see online, which he delivered at Tilt in the Netherlands this year. He says that it could be just an empty compliance measure, because what we saw in Europe, and I'll be interested to hear where this happens in Brazil, after the introduction of GDPR was, and just prior to the introduction of GDPR, was an explosion in the number of experts in data protection around offering consultancy and certification mechanisms and all of these things in order to ensure data protection compliance. Whether or not that kind of cottage industry of expertise around these regulatory techniques, which controllers might not know how to implement, like an impact assessment or audits of that type, these will be new things for data controllers. Whether or not that improves data protection, I don't know. There are some elements of the meta-regulation in the GDPR that have been quite heavily criticised. So, for instance, I would have thought instinctively that something like data protection by design would be something that would be quite well received. However, so that's the idea that was mentioned in the introduction today, that that at the very outset, when you were designing technologies, you design them in a way that embeds respect for data protection principles. For me, that seems like something quite beneficial, because you make this a more interdisciplinary conversation. We try and identify ways in which technology can actually implement the rules, and we don't think about data protection as an afterthought. You're thinking about it from the beginning. However, again, two professors in the Netherlands, Ronald Linus and Bert Jacobs, who are very well known in the field, have been very critical of this by saying that privacy simply cannot be hard-coded. It's not something that you code. It's an organizational issue. And rather than kind of trying to embed it from a technological perspective, you need to try and get organizational mentalities to change around data protection. So I think genuinely that's the benefit, or the potential benefit, of this type of meta-regulation. If you can get people in boardrooms, in high management, thinking about data protection as a right or as a risk, whichever, it doesn't really matter as long as they're thinking about it, then it could be useful in that way, but I just don't think we know yet. And I don't know how you would measure that in an easy way.
Então, estamos chegando no final desse primeiro painel.
First panel. I would like to thank, first of all, Orla, for your kindness, for being here. This Q&A session was very profitable. Thank you so much for your attendance. Now we'll have 15 minutes coffee break outside, and then we get back. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bom dia.
Good morning, everyone. Well, again, thank you for coming, and also our speakers that today are even more than speakers. They are quite active players in the building of a personal data protection law, which is a result of several discussions that took about 10 years, that started at the Ministry of Justice and had active participation of everyone in this panel. Therefore, our discussion today is going to be quite objective in terms of where we started from, what we aspired 10 years ago, of what a good law could be, and where we are here today. So discussions, I think, are going to be quite rich and objective, discussing the legal framework and basically focusing the main assumptions: consent, waive of consent, legitimate interests of controllers and third parties, everything thinking about the objectives of the law, which is to protect freedom, protect privacy, and ensure the fundamental rights, which is something that I think is very clear in the law, and that was approached in our first session. Therefore, I will first turn the floor to Marília, who is the Institutional Relations representative from Nubank, and is going to talk about the legal framework that is expressed in the law. So, Marília, you have the floor. Thank you, Flávia. First of all, I'd like to thank CGI for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm Marília. I'm from the Institutional Relations team of Nubank, and I'm going to talk a bit about our history to create a program with regard to privacy in Nubank, and how that fits to the panel's proposal, which is to talk about the legal framework of the data protection law. And for that, I'm going to take a step back. I would like to explain how the program was put together, how many people we are, what each of the competencies are. Well, we are a multidisciplinary team in Nubank. We have people from legal, from compliance, from information security, from data infrastructure. So a team that encompasses several competencies in Nubank, and we sit literally together and think how Nubank processes will adapt to the new norm. So our first challenges was to list the processes within our structure that handle with data protection and that would be subject to the law. After we listed the major processes, customer files, which is a big one, we started to go inside each major processes and list what they had in it. So customer information, what do you have? A purchase authorization, what are the processes? And so we started to map all possibilities within the legal framework that would be involved in these major processes. So as Flávia mentioned, consent is today understood in our legal tradition as the basis for the handling of personal data. What we see is that because there is no hierarchy in the legal framework, consent is just one item. It is not more or less important. So within 10 possibilities to handle personal data and sensitive data, we started to rank the major processes. And once we ranked and listed the main processes, we saw that no process would be outside the legal framework. And then we decided to analyze the microprocesses You know that the data life cycle goes through different processes. Should it be under the umbrella of a unique legal framework, or because we have different instances of handling, we should have a differentiation in our database? So that was the challenge. There is nothing specific saying that one data should not fit in different legal frameworks. But our internal decision was to classify each data point. When we are processing data, each processing has a specific purpose. And you know that transparency is one of assumption of law. And so we use that to guide our process. So it was a long process, and perhaps not as interesting to share with you. But anyway, it was a process that led us think of how we treated data at Nubank, data of our customers and of our employees, and the role of consent in the process. And this is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about consent, even to have a connection with Laura's lecture. So consent, as I said, has a very high weight, especially in the financial sector, in which you have the bank secrecy law 105 and other laws that approach consent. And today we are at a curve of knowledge and learning about consent that's still very steep. We have still to move a long way for people to understand that it's not only their authorization that can legitimate a process. And sometimes they cannot even authorize that, or it wouldn't be fair to authorize that. Because if consent is the only purpose of data, and an individual removes their consent, and then we say we can no longer provide services to you, we are having too much control over people's data. And so, given all that, we believe that the data protection law has other mechanisms of transparency and purpose that should be taken into consideration to beyond consent. But anyway, this is the discussion open for us to have here. And I think that it's interesting to hear from our colleagues. Thank you, Marília. Now I'll turn the floor to Dr. Professor Laura Charo Mendes, who is a professor of civil law in the University of Brasilia, the director of Net Internet and VDP, the German Association of Jurors, and master by UNB. Laura, you have the floor. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank CGI for the invitation. It's always a huge pleasure to be part of the seminar. That really contributes to us, and it's a place in which we have such interesting sharing of information. I also greet my member panelists, friends of a long time, that followed this long journey that Flávia mentioned, even before the first drafts of the law. So I think that we've come a long way together. We split the panel in a way that I would talk about consent, and I'll bring some reflections on that. I'll start reflections by the following. Consent brings lots of paradoxes if you think of it. On the one hand, when you think of consent in terms of information, it's considered a panacea. It is something that will fit it all. It is the express of the problem, and it is the solution of the problem. So if it's the expression of the problem, the solution of the problem. That is, if you have consent, you have no problems. On the other hand, if you use consent for just about everything, you are increasing bureaucracy. And people say, don't you think that you are making processes even more bureaucratic than they should be? So you see here that you have some contradiction. Another interesting topic about consent is that people think it is the heart, the core of the law, the instrument by excellence in which fundamental rights to data protection would be enforced. But the major discussion is, isn't consent a mere formality? When we think about a consent in which you just click a box, is it fiction or is it real consent? So these are all the issues that show the paradox around consent, and it shows the complexity of the topic. And I think this has to do with the brilliant lecture of Professor Ola that really brought a very interesting approach to rethink data protection. And perhaps even to talk about this paradox, I can use some examples. We talk about terms of use. There are different terms of use. There was one from a company that was famous in which consumers accepted their soul to be sold. It was a famous one. And some terms of use for smart TVs saying, I can activate the camera and the mic of your TV set at any point. Is it reasonable? And the question is, what is the freedom and effectiveness and even materiality of this consent? And beyond that, these were issues that we already had in consumer protection. What is the true freedom that people have when giving consent? There are even other issues that seem interesting when you're dealing with information flows. Think of the most current debate on algorithms. A recent case of Amazon, for instance, of a software, a recruitment software that was disabled by the company because the software was discriminatory. This was something that Reuters released because the machine said male candidates were ranked better than female candidates. And if you think about that, let's imagine that candidates or applicants consented for the use of their data in their algorithm. Is this consent valid, or rather than valid, what is the role of consent when you're talking about discrimination, when the output is discrimination? Does it make a change having consented or not? Or is it the problem, the real risk that the information brought? So all that to say, and I think that's the most important point, that consent has a long-time problem that we have known about when you talk about consumer protection, when you're talking about asymmetric information and asymmetric power. So these are problems in which formal consent cannot really solve the problem because it does not express material freedom of the individual. This is one thing, and we have talked about that thoroughly. In data protection, limitations to autonomy of your will and the material autonomy of your will, that is, fact-related structures, even because you have an unbalanced power or unbalanced information, and even because consumers do not have all the reason about the operation, then you do not have real freedom, and that affects data protection. Another thing that I would like to comment that is not that well known, which has to do specifically with data protection, which is the object of data protection, which is the information flow. When you're talking about information flow, what do all these more than 100 laws in the world want to prevent? Is it the risks of information? If it is to prevent risks, then it's no use to have consent. It's not only defining whether that data can or not be collected, can or not be used, because sometimes you don't know how the information is going to be interpreted. And here I'm talking about two discussions that approach this issue. Ellen Nisselbaum from the US, when she talks about contextual privacy, is saying exactly that. If you're looking at risks, it doesn't matter when the data was collected and what for, but how it's going to be used, in what context. So that's the American discussion. And also in Germany, that has its premise the criticism to this consent. And the concept that was developed at first by the German Constitutional Court. And the German discussion focuses on the following. We have to separate data from information. It's true that with data, you can have a more direct or straightforward approach. Who did I give that data to? However, in terms of how information is going to be used and interpreted, it is very difficult. I cannot say that someone has control over how information is going to be processed. So there are many limitations in terms of consent and autonomy. Some that we have known for a long time in consumer protection agencies and others, because it has to do with any freedom of consent that you have, be it in the real or digital world. But in data protection, we have another restriction that is inherent to the information flow. So quite often, it's very important to stop and think. Okay, consent is something important, undoubtedly, but it is not a blank check. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all, because I cannot avoid risk through consent. I cannot prevent information to be interpreted in some way based on the consent. And I'm going to mention another case and how important it is to discuss about that. The German Constitutional Court had a decision of 2008 It was an agency, a state agency, a state security agency in Germany, and they passed a state law saying that that agency could install Trojan horses in people's phones. And there was a complaint in the Constitutional Court, and there was consensus that it should be unconstitutional. And people said, okay, it's going to be considered unconstitutional due to the right to information that we had since 93. But to everyone's surprise, the court said, in a context in which you can no longer talk about control, if you are installing a spy software, that's the opposite of control. If you think, install a spy software in your notebook or smartphones, perhaps can be a greater invasion than have a camera at your place, because people will learn about everything we think, who we talk to, what we say. So perhaps it would be a much more powerful surveillance. And thinking about that, the court said the following. The right to information is no longer sufficient to this. People have to trust systems to work as they want them to work, that they are reliable. And as it happened in 83, they extracted from the free development to personality a guarantee of confidentiality of systems. Many of you work with information security, and that was extracted from the concept of information security. And that brought to light the following debate. When you're talking about information flows in our society, control is relevant, but it's not alone. You need the concept of reliability, legitimate expectation, how personal systems will work. I have to trust them, otherwise I won't be able to communicate myself. And when you think of this dependence that we have on the services and on the systems, protection of confidence is or of trust is even more important, because the fundamental right to information has a presupposition that is trust. I can only think about who I'm going to transfer data to, if I'm going to enable my data to be used in a context or not, if at least I can trust the system. And then that brought some subjects that were out of the discussion back in 83. All that to say that these are two major issues that affect or interfere the way we consider consent. In my German dissertation, I work with the idea that data protection, information protection should be standardized and materialized. I will try to explain what would be this materialization. That has to do with what I mentioned before. The first point would be indeed control that we already have, and I think that it continue to happen because we are going to have several terms of use, and it's natural that these terms have to be validated based on good faith, based on legitimate expectations, and based on principles that the data protection law brings. So this control of consent has to be based on objective elements. So that would be the first aspect, and it is a trend that will evidence materialization. So this first one is not so different from what we already see, but I believe this is going to be more and more frequent. If you think of, we had a credit card case, and basically we decided that one clause was no because of these principles, and this I think is going to continue. A second trend that also expresses materialization of self-determination is that it's not only concept per se, a consent in the contract that gives control. It is a whole architecture of the Internet. I want this control, this consent, to be part of the Internet architecture. And this is something that we didn't have when we have this approach that was basically contract-focused, because then you got the contract and you said, well, this clause is okay, this is abusive, this is null. But when you're thinking about Internet architecture, things change. I say, why should consent be restricted to contract if the architecture can expand or restrict control? So the second element of materialization, the second trend, would be that. And here I use some expressions also come from German law. Protection by the system, which has to do with design, and self-protection, the idea that people can decide, and we see that somehow on our iPhones, on our smartphones in general. I can ask or determine the level of protection I want. And I think that this is a much more interesting trend to try to exercise control than what we had before. And a third element has to do with risks, which is the idea that data protection is not restricted to legitimacy conditions or the legal framework of Section 7 of our law. But when you think of principles, the principles of data protection can help us identify risks to some kind of data treatment. For instance, in the case of algorithms, that data treatment was consented. However, that does not mean that the consent is a blank check, because the law itself can assess risks of data treatment. So risk assessments are many. As Professor Orla mentioned, it can be by regulation, which is the most obvious. You forbid or enable some kind of use, but there are several ways of assessing risk. And clearly, if we don't look at risks, and therefore we don't look into the idea that data protection focuses control and trust, then you're going to have a limited view of things. So I would close saying that this trend to materialize this control is the idea that I try to reinforce a material control on what's possible, but this won't deplete this discipline. I also need to have a contextual privacy to avoid risks, be it through the principles of the law, but also other specific legislations that may appear once specific risks appear on specific sectors. Therefore, I close my presentation, and I will be willing to receive your questions. Obrigada, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. I think what Laura said shows clearly the relationship between the estimates about consent and how this guarantee freedom, which is a prerequisite of the law and on the civil framework that deals consent as something very restrictive. I think that this highlights something that was mentioned by Ola, which is the need to see the collective defense, not only by the civil society, but also the public powers to follow up these risk situations, the lack of legitimation when user gives their consent, so that regulations are made. That's why we regret that the National Authority for Personal Data Protection do not have an independent character, and it's part of the federal executive power, because with all these issues, we require a constant supervision of this power, which needs to create a conversation between what we need and freedom, which is what legitimates the law. So I hand it over to Carlos Afonso. He has a master's degree and PhD degree from the Federal University in Rio. He's a law professor at the Federal University of Rio and Público. He's a founder of TS and is also part of the some groups of OAB, of the Bar Association in Rio. Well, and he has many other titles, and it's really great to listen to what he has to say. Super thanks, Flavia. First of all, thanks the committee for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here participating in this seminar. And it's really interesting to see we have a full house. And this shows the importance of this topic. For many of us that work for many, many years on this topic and participating on a yearly basis on this seminar, it's really great to see the increased interest on this topic. My mission today is to talk about one of the requirements for data treatment. And my mission is to talk about legitimate interests. But taking the cue on what Laura said, she said consent is not a blank check. I thought it was really interesting. Legitimate interests are not as well a blank check. So we can state here that no requirement to treat personal data is a blank check. And this communicates something very important. This panel focus on Article 7 and 11 of the law, analyzing which are the basis, the pre-requirements for the treatment of personal data. But we would like you to not be happy with this premise and not have the feeling that once the requirement is done, we'll have mission accomplished and we can do whatever we want with personal data. This communication is very important. The requirement you choose to treat personal data is just the beginning of a long process involving many important situations about the analysis and understanding of the useful life of this data, how the data will be treated. And it's important to understand the peculiarities of one of these requirements, which are the legitimate interests of the controller. So a part of the consent, we have these other 9 bases for the treatment of personal data. This is a graphical way to show Article 7. We are not working with sensitive data. So sensitive data are not included, and I will start here. We have here a big surprise. All my points are important because they are point 1. Along the next slides, you'll see equally important points. But it's always, you won't be able to choose your favorite point according to the importance of the following slides. First point, they are all equally important. Legitimate interests are a requirement included on Article 7, but not on Article 7. So the first option is that legitimate interests are not an option if you are dealing with sensitive data. We need to understand which data you're working with, the nature of this data. If it's a sensitive data, this legitimate interest requirement is not the right one for you. So the first point is to understand the nature of the data you are working and if legitimate interests is an option. Second, I think the LGPD and the civil
de que o artigo 7º, inciso 9º do Marco Civil,
the civil landmark is the article about consent, and Article 7 and 11 from LGPD is about legitimate interests. What this means, I have no idea. But the point is, Article 7, Clause 9, brings or mentions about legitimate interests. He says, when necessary to meet legitimate interest of the controller or third party, except in the case of prevailing rights and freedoms which are fundamental of the holder that require protection of personal data. This gives us the wrong impression is that when I choose legitimate interest, this data is not protected because it seems you select legitimate interest except when certain situations require data protections. So it is worthwhile. I think it's important to reinforce this point, that the choice for legitimate interest does not mean that data are not protected. This requirement of legitimate interest is a flexible one. It seems to be the one that adapts to a larger number of situations. But it's also one of, or the more complex one, creating a series of obligations. This is a message for those who believe that choosing legitimate interest will make the life of the entity or the company easier. Maybe you are falling into a trap where we won't have the real dimension of all conditions that will be required for the treatment of that personal data. So the ample use of legitimate interest occurs because of its flexibility, because it's open to new uses of a data without the need to interact with the data holder to get his agreement. To a certain extent, it is worth using the image that this article, it's like a radar, because the consent requires the entity will interact with the holder of data. Legitimate interests do not need this requirement. So I decided to use legitimate interest, and I would have an interaction with the holder of the personal data. So this explains the ample adoption of this principle for innovative situation, business, so legitimate interests appear as this movement. But it's worth mentioning that when you give the consent, there is a consideration on the part of personal data holder to understand that this data will be traded, and you need to agree and accept these terms. In this case of legitimate interest, this division of risk is non-existent because there's no interaction with data holder. When you give your consent, entity that will trade data can say, you needed to read the use terms and click saying you accept. But I would like to have terms of use saying, I haven't read, but I agree. So this is an honored solution for situations like this. It won't solve problems of data protection, but it solves our ethical problem, which is so legitimate interest promotes the situation where this risk division doesn't exist. The entity took upon itself the responsibility of treating with this data. We were not going to discuss about direct marketing. On direct marketing, the GDPR includes the possibility of using legitimate interest for this practice. This is not an open check. In Europe, you have different rules that will restrict direct marketing. But on Consideranda 47, the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for a legitimate interest, especially if there is a previous contract between controller and the holder of the personal data. Can I seek clients or new clients through the email or their phone? Another example is the background check. And here we need to remind you something important. Why I'm mentioning background checks? Many companies are using legitimate interest as an explanation to do background checks before the hiring. And this is a message which is very important. LGPD is not the beginning, middle, and end of a discussion about data protection. In this case, labor justice is very restrictive in accepting background checks. And we have here a very interesting situation. On the one hand, legitimate interest is adequate for a checking of personal records for hiring someone. But the Superior Court has many decisions saying only for specific positions, very specific places, you can use it, like criminal records for someone who will be responsible for the security of your store. Okay, but this is an important message for us to understand that the discussion about legitimate interest cannot be completed on this discussion between Article 7 and 11th. 10th. Article 10th shed light to these events of these two events, direct marketing and background checks. It says that legitimate interest of controller will only ground the treatment of personal data for legitimate purposes, taken into account based on concrete situations that include, but are not limited to, support and promotion of activities of the controller and the protection in relation to the holder. Going to the last 5 minutes of my presentation, knowing that we have this dialogue between Article 7 and 10th to draw the contour of the legitimate interest, we should know in practice if we have or not a legitimate interest to treat this data. And we should bear in mind that we have a myriad of tests, technologies, new ways of treating this question. But independently of the test or methodology to be adopted, to do an assessment of legitimate interests, Article 37 sends a message to controllers and operators saying they should register all operations for treating personal data, especially when based on legitimate interests. So legislators, when they treat all activities done by operator and controller, send a message that you need to register all these steps. So how do I know if I have or not a legitimate interest? Among the many technologies and methodologies, I would like to highlight the one indicated or recommended by the task force. We have a 4-stage test, and this presents us a clear view of these stages and what I need to do. So I'll try to cover them briefly, but the idea is to assess if it is legitimate on the part of the controller to treat this data. And how I know if my interest is legitimate and if I can treat this data. What are the indicators that were selected? Your interest is supported in a fundamental right. If your interest meets the needs of a public interest, it is connected with other requirements for data treatment, or you just have the legitimate interest. Is there any recommendation or social acknowledgement about this practice? This is very important when we discuss on the data holder side the legitimacy of this data. So I'm not analyzing on the approach of the controller, but the data holder. Do I need to treat this data? What is the impact for the data holder? So I need to assess the impact, the interest of the personal data, how the personal data will be treated, the expectations of the data holder, and the profile of the controller who will execute these steps. So I start to weigh both sides of the scale, seeing if the data are transparent, if I'm affecting legitimate interests of the data holder, and a fourth step, which is if on stage 3 I decide that I can treat this data, I haven't completed the test. I have a 4th stage that will define if I have additional safeguards criteria to check if I have indicators to adopt and use this data. So in summary, these are the 4 stages that the Article 29 define. My next slides will repeat these, showing the articles of LGPD that applies to this movement. So the first one is legitimacy, the second focus on personal data holder personal position, and doing this balance involving this legitimate expectation and fundamental rights.
And finally, a safeguard analysis involving transparency, opposition mechanisms, and any risk mitigation. And that has come across quite frequently. Some companies adopt quite proactively a visualization of these measures of phase 4. And we have several examples of visualization of rights, which are important for us to complete phase 4 of the legitimate interest analysis. So I'm going to close now, leaving you the slide with these 4 phases for us to understand or analyze whether a company or controller has interest, legitimate interests to treat data. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, CAF. Eu acho que a fala do CAF deixa muito claro.
Thank you, CAF. I think it's very clear that the counterpart of legitimate interest is an accountability need, and also highlights, I believe, how the Consumer Protection Agency is going to be important with regard to abusive clauses, abusive practices for us in this field of law and rights to be able to exercise our rights. Now, Marcus Gerhard Lindemeyer, a bachelor's in legal and social sciences from the University of Rio Grande do Sul, head of staff of the Union Ombudsmanship Agency. He worked in the implementation of access to information law in the federal government, and also in the regulation of the treatment of secrecy information at the presidency of Brazil's level. Since 2016, he has been representing Brazil as an observer of the Ibero-American Protection Law Agency. I'm going to stand because I'm not that tall, so I want everyone to see me. Hello. Good morning. Or is it good afternoon? I don't know. Well, differently from my colleagues in the panel, I can perhaps bring a new perspective as almost an insider in the government throughout the process of the data protection law. And also having gone through implementation at the federal level. So I'm sometimes a bit cautious to give you certainty. So perhaps my role here is to raise questions, doubts, some of them even approached to by Marta when she asked the question in the previous panel. So we are going to talk about the impact of the law at the public government level. So why the law applies to the public power? Because we are perhaps the greatest holder of data in Brazil. Our database is not only 80 million. We are talking about 210 million inhabitants that are already are born in our database. So indeed, the state is the greatest holder of private data in Brazil. And more than that, we thought that the state, by connecting or collecting personal information, would give secrecies guarantee over the information. And we have that in CDN when we talk about bank secrecy. We talk about the IBGL law of 68 that talks about secrecy of data collected. So whenever the state intervened or tried to seek data from the population, it had a legal device that guaranteed secrecy. But we said, well, what's the harm of giving information to the state? Well, there is harm. We can no longer think of secrecy as the only protection that is necessary. There is other information. In 2011, the Information Access Law brought in Section 31 regulation on what personal data should be at the public administration level and how it should be treated. And also talked about purpose, needs, time to keep, who would be entitled to have access to information, what third parties should access the information. So it was quite straightforward, but it was there. What's interesting is that when it talks about personal information, you are talking about necessary, that is necessary to preserve your image and honor. So everything that was built at the government level has to do with the Constitution that, in a way, is connected to the data protection law. But that is not enough. Now we have a major opportunity, not only from this perspective of putting citizens in the center of the discussion in how we are going to use their data, but also simplify the role of the government. But that also brings relevant issues. There are some microsystems that have to be balanced. Perhaps the most relevant that went through the data protection law, which is information. What is the impact of information? And that does not only happen in Brazil. In Chile, they are carrying out a large discussion in terms of transparency, and the information agency should be the national authority on that. Mexico, MINAI, a giant institution, works with access to information and data protection, and others. So what are the direct implications? One of them is the following. Should we have a disclaimer in our law? So you're talking about personal information of civil servants. There are mitigation of privacy in the relation with the publication of wages. but also the treatment of public data should consider the purpose, good faith, and public interest. And also we talk about state safety, public safety. In section 3rd or 4th, we have that these articles of law should not apply to those areas, but it does apply because we should also observe the rights, the procedures, and there are several obligations related to information to the national authority. So, how do you address possible tensions between a national authority and protection and defense agencies? These are questions that also came about when the Information Access Law was passed. And then what we think about how the government should handle the information. Well, we have public policies that are already present in our laws or in regulations, and can they do away with consent? Can they do away with legitimate interest? Not necessarily. But public policies are many. They can be any state action that are strategic and operational. So any action provided in the law that has a strategic or operational components can be considered a public policy. And there is another thing. Is there the possibility of expanding the scope in the specific case of legitimate interest? I don't know. When a control agency conducts a preliminary investigation to start a process, so you're starting to investigate responsibilities, accountabilities, etc. How about the period before? The holder of that data would be entitled to see the information, because, see, this is not a criminal investigation. It is an administrative investigation. And these are questions I'm asking. I don't have the answers. And even more than that, I remember that during the discussions, the state has always showed a fear of asking for consent for everything. But the problem is not the consent. And I think this is where the most important issue lies. The most important thing is the exercise of rights of holders, and also the access to treatment by holders, access to how information is processed. And this is something that we already had in the Information Access Law. And that sometimes clashes with the role of the state. In addition, what are the limits of the state when opposing the exercise of such rights? This is something that we have to see case by case. We might have litigations. It may happen. And there's another point here that is quite important. I believe that we don't have enough legal mechanisms to exercise the rights. Why is that? Information law is federal. The administrative process is federal. Habeas corpus is federal. So you would have the possibility of regulation at different levels. And that, to me, is a problem. NDP cannot, at least in a first interpretation, cannot pass a law that has to do with procedures to everyone. And then we would have a multiplicity of processes from different state levels. In addition, after 7 years working in information access law, we never had managers that wanted to talk about privacy. And this is important. And also to talk about transparency by design processes. And when the public or when the government wants to keep a large set of data and a large set of protections over information, more and more, the government has to be aware of which data is more important. So perhaps out of 70 million data from users, perhaps some are not interesting to be kept for public policies. At the federal level, and perhaps at state level too, people are talking about the improvement of services by improving efficiency. And what people have been doing is what they call service census. There is analyzing what information will be necessary for that service to be provided. But we have very high implementation costs in a budget scenario that is not at all very good. And in terms of savings in the midterm, we can think of centralization of database. Today we have several databases referring to the same citizens and sometimes with conflicting information. We also have to put them together in a more suitable manner with sharing by means of APIs and development of controls and access records, amongst others. When we talk about access control and access registers, how can we have gains of scale? In Brazil, we cannot make large normative changes easily, but national systems and national IT systems created a new condition, which is called law or legislation by systems. What does it mean? You create a norm, I don't know, establishing special procedures and of safeguard procedures, and you install them in a database that already has the safeguard procedures. I don't know if you've seen this movie, Fahrenheit. What happens? What is the implication of the clause on the elimination of information after its purpose is terminated? Think of public files. When you think of public files, you talk about primary and secondary value. Purpose has to do with primary value. The permanent value is the secondary value, is the historical value, the proof value. And we know that history is built by different levels and also by a large set of private information. And that was a concern of ours in the inter-American discussion when we were discussing the principles for data protection. Unfortunately, we have not addressed this topic yet, but it is something that we will have to face. Well, I know I used less than the time I had, but we are going to open for questions, and you can ask me whatever you want. Thank you.
Obrigada, Marcos. Nós temos aí meia hora.
Thank you, Marcos. We have half an hour for discussion. And so I'm going to open for the audience to ask questions, send us questions online. If you want, you just raise your hands and the mic is going to get to you.
Por favor, quem for falar, se identifique, que é importante.
Hi, my name is Isabella. I'm a lawyer. I have some experience in IT. I know there is an initiative at the federal government level that is based on FACIN. I don't know if you know it. The idea is to integrate and put together several systems and everything that is running in Serpo and other database to try and have a better sharing of information of our citizens. I think it's very good, but at the same time, we are seeing information on the leakage of data. The last was in Ecuador, and almost all citizen data was exposed. And we also have been following Brazil, the government's intention of privatizing Serpro. Could you talk a bit about this? Because it is quite worrisome. Two more questions so that we can put them all together, and then we open to the panel. Hello, I'm Alexandra. I work for Accenture. Last week, we had an event in Rio, and there was a question from someone that I found very interesting, and I'm going to ask you. She works for a multinational company, and she's responsible for expatriates. And one of the items for you to have expatriation, because of the security issue in Rio de Janeiro, is to have the geolocation in cell phones, GPS and others. And we were discussing if that would require consent or not, and what the relationship would be between employer and employee. Based on the principles, I would like to know your opinion on the legal basis for this request. I'm Vinicius from Campo Seguradora. I am from the team that is proposing the suitability project in Caixa Seguradora. Yesterday, I had an event with actuaries, and one of the questions was the following. This is an accountant that works with the closed pension agencies. And he mentioned something, and I would like to ask our panelists about that. How do you think the government is going to work in this sense? He says that sometimes he's going to provide actuarial work for a pension, a closed pension fund, and there is lots of loss of data. Previous administrators, for instance, previous governors or previous mayors, sometimes purposely delete older information because of political issues. And there is always a difficulty to see data from previous administrations. And he, as a controller in actuarial services, needs data to do his work. And new administrator says, do you have the data of the previous administration to continue treating data? And he doesn't. So I would like you to talk about this relationship, operator and controller, because sometimes administrators are not very careful about data. Okay. I'm going to turn to the panel now, and then we take 3 more questions. I would just like to share your concern about the news of privatizing not only Serpro, but also DataPrev, and to what extent our rights are going to be protected, and what kind of vulnerability you're going to have in a scenario like this. Who would like to answer? Marcos, perhaps you could start? Well, as for organizing data that is scattered through several databases, I think that this is something that we need, and there is no other way. We have to bring them together because of costs, because we are going to improve information, and we are going to make things simpler to citizens. Sometimes the citizen wants a public service, and they have to submit several documents several times. Specifically about Serpro, I think there are 2 issues here. One is the discussion on the privatization of Serpro and other companies that provide this kind of service to the federal administration, and the maintenance of this database in these companies. I think this is not compatible to keep the data. But I cannot really answer much about this because it's really out of my scope. I don't know if anyone else would like to talk about this. As for managing information, especially at the municipal level, that has also to do with a very complicated issue in Brazil. We have 5,570 municipalities in Brazil, some much smaller than a block in São Paulo, with the management maturity that is also quite variable. Many do not have electronic processes, many do not have file management, and we, as control agencies that investigated municipalities, we see that from one administration to the other, information is lost, even private information. And here we have two major problems. We are working at an LGPD level, and we should be working at a file management level. We have a law for that, we have a structure for that, but we have deficiencies in implementation. And obviously, in implementation, you have to work within the process by design prospect. As for CGU, and we have been doing that with the national file, is that recently there was an initiative by the Network of Transparency and Access to Information, an inter-American agency, to set a work group to work with file management in the perspective of transparency. And we recently discussed, and we are starting to discuss, the update of this model from the Transparency Network to file management for transparency and data protection. The platform that we developed is IED, and now we are working with the national file for them to spread this platform to its file system. So this is the step. But when I told you what is difficult is to implement policies is because we have major challenges. The city of São Paulo, the municipality of São Paulo, is completely different from a municipality in the inland of the country. So that's it. And think of expatriates. This is a very interesting topic because if you consider that that is an employee in a labor relation, this situation, I believe, requires an implied consent. That is, the employee knows that geolocation data is going to be made available from their devices to the company. If you are implementing that without the awareness of employees, I think this is very difficult. I think here legitimate interest in section 10, paragraph 2, talks about that. It talks about protection of the holder in the exercise of their rights or provision of services that can benefit them. So undoubtedly, this control will benefit the employee because it covers for them, for their security. But again, legitimate interest goes beyond the benefit. So it seems to me that no matter how complex the consent would be, I think this would be database that would be especially sensitive because, geolocation has lots of information, and I think it would be best to work with consent than with legitimate interest. And in terms of requirements, perhaps this is the least important, because if you have this kind of monitoring, you shed light not to the entrance of data, but in safeguard measures, that is, in how to treat data. So again, what's important is who is going to have access to this data in the company, how this data is going to be used. So perhaps for employees, it's much more interesting to understand how data is going to be treated, safeguard measures, than specifically to know whether you have the consent or not. But it's a very interesting discussion, undoubtedly. Still, about this case, that's indeed a very interesting question. I think it's interesting. When you think of consent in Section 5, it talks about free, informed, specific manifestation. And free here is very important when you talk about a work relation. In general, because a work relation is by definition a relationship of hierarchy, and several work groups have already discussed that, is that consent should be used in situations in which you can minimally ensure some kind of freedom. In work relations, it might be safer. Of course, you have to see each case in detail, but perhaps it's best to understand or to approach the topic in terms of legitimate interest or even regulatory obligations that are important for employers. Legitimate interest, which is how to exercise that activity, and other aspects that can be used. I agree with Cass. I think that in this case, we should not think of one model fits all. You have first the conditions of legitimacy and requirements, and second, what procedures are you implementing to guarantee these rights? So I think safeguards is very important if you really have a security procedure in place to prevent access to this information.
Well, just adding the point that Lauren Kauf presented, the design of the governance of this collection. If there is transparency, if we have the option of not having this data collected, other security points like armored car and rail, and the route he does to come and go to work, and the days he works. So we don't want it to have a standard collection of geolocalization. So this may minimize the impact, guaranteeing his security in Rio. We have here the question from Nivaldo, and then I will move to online questions. Good afternoon. I represent the entrepreneurial sector, and I'm really worried with this huge personal database that we have in all offices in Brazil. Any citizen can go to the commercial registry and check my personal data. I want to know if this new law will force the state to change this behavior. Or when I register a company, and we have millions of companies, I need to expose to society my personal data. This is extremely open. What's the responsibility of the government to make this data public and accessible to any citizen? On the one hand, it's very positive, but on the other hand, someone may use this data for evil. Well, we have a question from Milena. In face of the information that legitimate interest does not apply to sensitive data, the use of non-sensitive data, when someone starts to go to church, hospital, we stop doing geolocalization collection based on legitimate interests. Percival Counselor has also another question.
Então, uma preocupação
Before defining issues of legitimate interest, which data are eligible for collection, and which data we can do any kind of intervention, I have two major concerns. One, it's a sin that we always try to standardize technology. As we cannot see the future, we need to check the current moment, the state of the art, and state of the art just shows us the tip of the iceberg. This is the first concern. What is included in the law or in the process in a systematic way to update all new definitions. We are talking today about geolocalization, but we have many other data collection that may lead to some results, geolocation, that we can understand, that we can hardly understand. Imagine the legislator to include this in the law. And another point is the permission, authorization. You cannot deny or agree with something that you can't understand. How can we do this? How do we control this? Those who cannot be aware of what they are doing, depending on the level of this collection. How to do hyposufficiency, which is not relative, it's an absolute issue, and how to deploy this process of retrofeeding data in relation to legislation, so we stop regulation, something that belongs to the past.
Começando pela última.
Well, starting by your last question, the law of data protection is highly agnostic and timeless. The role of this update, what we intend, it's up to the authority and the plural approach of this authority, so based on understanding and interpretations, not to have an excessive standardization of technology. They may make sense today, but not in the future. So the authority will need to have this fundamental role. About commercial registries, we face the same dilemma that domain systems suffer to adapt their registrations to review or not personal data. There is a pre-requirement in the disclosure of this information, at least on the commercial registries. And I forgot the other question. When legitimate interest disappears. CAFE show the spaces that we can use to define if it applies to legitimate interest, especially when you prepare reports that will attribute risk to that treatment. This is part of the risk analysis when it includes processing in legitimate interest, is the need to disclose or not personal data. This will be part of this analysis, of risk analysis. Well, thanks for the great questions. So let's start with legitimate interest. If we think on a chain of data treatment, when we first collect that data could not be considered as sensitive data. So in this initial context, you treat the data based on legal standards of Article 7. When you do different actions, and when it becomes clear what other sensitive information will be disclosed along the treatment, you need other legal framework, and you won't be able to use legitimate interest as an element. This is a dynamic process to evaluate the legal basis. What's important to highlight here is that indeed the protection that we have for non-discrimination based on the data that I have less basis is not only protection for discrimination. It's the first discrimination. I remove legitimate interest approach, and I say that for this sensitive data, I cannot apply legitimate interest. This is an objective and initial protection. But the law bans any kind of discrimination independently of the type of data being used. I can use personal data without using any sensitive data, and the final result, the output, can be discriminatory. In this sense, I'll have a different protection posed by the law. So when we think about protection against discrimination, you have an initial one, but I have an article in the law that protects this discrimination. In relation to commercial registries, all states will need to revisit their treatments based on the law. And your question has to do with revisiting this based on principles. The question is there a public interest to disclose all data or just part of this? So based on the law, we should do this on all commercial registries. In relation to update, this is a very hot topic. We have two bases on the law that try to discuss this constant update. The first is the principle of the law, as well presented by Marília, and the big question here is the psychological aspect. Yes, we have the authority. We need to develop this in the law. We have the principle of accountability. We have many other rules that the law poses, like conduct codes, governance codes, and conduct codes can be approved by the authorities. With the technological development, this update, this responsibility is also divided with the government, with citizens, but part of it belongs to the companies who should organize themselves and interpret this law. So with the principle of accountability, this is a way to update legislation. I would like to make a brief comment. When we have situations where we have sensitive data in the treatment of this data. In the beginning of your presentation, you said you went through a process to define all processes and sub-processes. Is there a process to review constantly review or standards to define how you can define criteria to guide these processes. I think these are highly complex technical issues which are very expensive, but in situations like the one presented by the online participant, they require a constant supervision. For me, as an user, it's very difficult to understand how this happened and if it really happens. I hand it over for the other panelists, and then I will give the floor back to you. So very briefly, about sensitive data, we have one point in the law that doesn't help us, which is the idea that the law talks about impact reports on the protection of personal data, and it repeats constantly this expression. But we have an assessment of legitimate interest or not. The case presented in the question is the case when the assessment of legitimate interest cannot be the ideal one because we are focusing on data which are not sensitive. But as to data protection, they should include. This is a typical situation that when we understand the data which seem not to be sensitive indicates the case of sensitive data, you should change how you deal with this data. And then you go to Article 11. Not only in this case, but in many other cases, we'll have different situations for data treatment. On Article 11, we have many cases presented, like the hypothesis presented on items D and G, and there are many other tools on Article 11, and if the data change, they should meet this dynamic. I would like to thank the person controlling time. He gave us the green line. We have a signal here in front of us showing green, yellow, and red, and it moved back to green. The dynamics between CDC and LGBT is something that we need to pay attention. Based on what was approved in the Civil Code in 2002, many instructions included in the Civil Code were interpreted by CDC because that's how we used to do before this addition in the Civil Code. We have the objective good faith in CDC, which was built over decades. This good faith took into account the aspect of vulnerability. The good faith of 422 of the Civil Code.
Positivos. Então eu acho que
So this dynamics of understanding the experience of CDC that brought us up to the moment and how LGBT moves this forward based on this experience with similarities and difference, it's an important challenge for us to understand. I'm trying to I'll try to be even briefer. I won't go to the yellow light. Well, about it's regulated. There is a specific regimen for recorders committees. I think this is the discussion that I raised in the beginning. It's very difficult to talk about how a law will relate with other standards without being regulated and more. After being regulated, It's difficult because it also applies with other standards that create obligations like publicity and privacy that we have in Portuguese. We need to evaluate the case by case and what applies to the public interest and the social control and which are not necessary. Again, taking into account some exceptions in relations to legal persons that has a relationship with the state. So I hand it over. Well, the team that sits together once a week, they review processes we are doing in terms of classification, especially when engineers who are designing the system, the technical design to adapt the law, when they face something that made no sense to them, we go back and we review all the steps. So a month ago, something made sense, and then we start to revisit, and we see that we need to revalidate. This is documented and approved by the management. But this is a process, how to validate legal basis of processes and sub-processes that we have internally. But this is made manually and dynamic. Well, it's red here, but we still have 18 seconds. I would like to thank the audience and to thank the rich contribution of our panelists. Have a good lunch, drink lots of coffee, and we'll have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.